All right, y'all, we're going to get started. Hopefully people will trickle in as they arrive. Thank you all very much for being here on a Friday night. We're very excited to share our kestrel research with you. My name is Eleanor Harris. I'm one of the co-directors of the Clifton Institute, and of course, my husband and co-director Bert Harris will be giving the talk tonight. He'll tell you a little bit more about Clifton in case you don't know who we are, where we are, what we do. But we'd love to see some of you in person at some point, sometime in the future. You can come on a program or come on a walk or just come say hi. We'd love to meet you in person. Just a couple Zoom logistics. We're expecting a pretty big crowd, excuse me. So we have set this up as a webinar. So Bert's going to be the only one that will be allowed to speak or be on video. I'm going to dash off to another computer in just a second, but I can be in the chat. So if you do have any problems, let me know in the chat, but also if you have any questions, if they're like immediate that Bert can address at the moment, I'll chime in and let him know. And otherwise I'll just kind of be saving them until the end of the talk and then I'll feed them to Bert that way. We are also recording, since we shouldn't have your videos on. That shouldn't be a problem, but I do just want to let you know, and then we'll send out the recording to everybody in a couple of days when we've processed that video. I think that's all the Zoom logistics. I know many of you have met.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
You can just add your questions in the chat as we go along. Oh, didn't hear that part. That's great.
I know a lot of you have met Bert in person, but in case you haven't, I just wanted to take a minute to introduce who he is and why he's qualified to give this talk. So Bert did his undergraduate work at Sewanee in Tennessee and then went and got a PhD, and in all of his schooling he was studying birds, so he's an ornithologist by training, but the last couple of years he's really branched out into all sorts of other taxon and is interested in pretty much anything outside here in Virginia and across the world. And he's particularly focused on studying species that are in decline and the ways that we can conserve those in our region and across the world. And a focus of his and ours at Clifton Institute is prairie lands, which is going to connect today in some of the habitats that kestrels are using. So I'm excited to hear what we've learned so far. I'm going to dash off and I'll be on the chat.
Okay, thank you all very much for joining. It's great to see such interest in kestrels. And before I get going, I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Joe Kolowski, Alan Williams, Kalen Wolfer, and Megan McDaniels. This work is just as much theirs as mine, and it's a really big team effort, as you'll see, for all the results that I'm presenting. And I'm going to be talking about our research that we've been doing over the last couple of years, trying to understand why kestrels are declining in our region. So to outline the talk, I'm going to start with a brief introduction to the Clifton Institute, talk about what we do. Then I'm going to talk about the natural history of the American kestrel. Then I'll get into our methods for this research. I'll talk about our results for home ranges, forays, and long distance movements. Then I'll talk about habitat selection. And finally, I'll talk about fledgling movements and mortality. So the Clifton Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have 8 full-time staff, and we're funded by individual donations and foundation grants. And our 3 program areas are education, restoration, and research. Our mission is to inspire a deeper understanding and appreciation of nature, to study the ecology of our region, to restore habitat, and to conserve native biodiversity. And we're located about an hour west of Washington, D.C. and Fauquier County, Virginia. And we're really lucky to have a 900-acre property, which has an amazing diversity of habitats. It's about half forest and half fields of different ages. And we're doing a long-term inventory of the species on iNaturalist, and we are up over 2,000 species. And just one of the recent highlights was this cupped fringe lichen, which is an indicator of mature forest. So it's pretty cool to see that one still hanging on at Clifton. To talk briefly about our environmental education programs, we do field trips to our local schools, we do summer camps, And these days, all of our education programs are based on research. So the kids come out and do research projects that are appropriate for their age group, and they learn about how science is done and about conservation and ecology. We also do a variety of natural history and conservation programs for adults. And last year we had 1,900 kids and 900 adults come through for our various programs. For research, for the last few years, we've been studying Piedmont prairies, and these are grassland remnants in our area that are windows into the past. And so they enable us to see what the big grasslands and savannas would have looked like in the Piedmont that were once widespread. And there hasn't been that much research on northern and central Piedmont prairies in Virginia. So we teamed up with some other researchers to look at that, and we found an amazing diversity of plants, the most diverse plant communities in the whole state, in fact. And we also discovered that they were pretty threatened, and that a lot of the plants that grew in these prairies are not sold by seed companies. So if you want to do a restoration project, you can't actually find those species. And that led to some other restoration and propagation work that we're doing. We're also starting a project on the restoration of forest understories in our region, and we're going to be comparing the effects of prescribed fire and deer exposures to restore herbaceous plant diversity in the understory. We're also launching a project on the effects of mowing on box turtles. So we're going to be doing mark recapture surveys and radio telemetry to try to understand how mowing affects box turtles and how landowners can mitigate the effects of mowing and hay cutting. So hopefully you can see that our research is very applied, and the goal of our research is to give landowners the tools they need to manage their land to benefit declining species. For restoration, so like I said, we have 900 acres that we're managing, and that includes about 300 acres of grasslands and shrublands. And we focus on managing those areas because early successional habitats like those host more declining species than other habitats. And one of the projects we've been working on is a 100-acre restoration experiment where we're trying different ways of converting a fescue pasture into a native grassland. That's what this fire picture is showing. And like I mentioned, we've been working on seed collection and propagation. In addition to a lot of the species that we'd like to plant not being available, if the species are available, they tend to have genetics from other states. And so they bloom at the wrong time, or they're too tall, or they're too short. So we really need a source of Virginia ecotype seeds. And so we've teamed up with several partners, including Virginia State University, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, the Nature Conservancy. And we applied for a conservation innovation grant from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and we were successful with the grant, and we were able to hire Isaac Matlock, who is our native seed project coordinator. And we've now launched this project to produce seeds to get the native seed industry going in Virginia. So we're collecting seeds across the state, we're growing seedlings, and we're going to be giving those to farmers who will then plant crops of native plants to produce seeds at scale. I also wanted to mention that we have a land management outreach associate, Marie Norwood. She's been with us for 2 years, and she's visited 150 landowners who manage 11,000 acres in that time. So this is a free service that we offer to landowners who would like to get advice on how to manage their land to benefit biodiversity. So if you're interested in that, you can send her an email. So now on to the kestrels. So the American kestrel is North America's smallest falcon, and they're found in big open fields, and they mainly eat insects and small rodents, as well as a few birds. And if you get a good look, they're pretty easy to identify males versus females. Females are rufous with black bars, whereas males have bluish gray wings and a rufous tail with a black subterminal band. Kestrels nest in natural cavities or nest boxes. They have a clutch size of 5, and they usually only do 1 nesting attempt per year. And in this picture, you can see 4 kestrel eggs and 1 starling egg, which is like a big robin egg. This is what you want to look out for in your kestrel box, because we don't want to be breeding starlings. Kestrels have a 30-day incubation period, a 30-day nestling period, and the fledglings are dependent on the adults after they leave the nest for 2 weeks. The lifespan is approximately 3 years with a record of 11 years. And now I want to show a couple of videos so you get an idea of what these birds are like. So it's pretty cool. So the male just left and the female is still in the box. You can see one of the eggs has just hatched, probably today. So there's a tiny little baby in there. Pretty cool. And so this footage was taken from a security camera that we've started installing in boxes to learn more about what's happening inside. We're going to be installing security cameras in 30 boxes this year as part of our project. So another one a little bit later in the cycle here. You can see the male has, high expectations here. Wasn't breaking the bowl up into small enough pieces for those babies. So it was an unlucky day for the babies. I think this all turned out fine though, don't worry. So the American kestrel is found across North and South America, except for the high Arctic and the Amazon. So this is a widespread bird that is not in danger of extinction globally, but we are seeing some worrying declines in the eastern US. And we need to reverse those declines, and we need to understand what's causing them, because kestrels are not the only ones. There are a lot of other grassland birds that are worse off than kestrels, and we really don't know why very well. So there's a lot to learn still about these grassland birds. So I mentioned the decline. If you look at the North American Breeding Bird Survey and the Audubon Christmas bird count for Maryland and Virginia, we see slow and steady declines in our region. On the y-axis is the number of kestrels, and on the x-axis is the year. And there are a lot of possible reasons behind this decline, and nobody knows which is most important. And of course, that's what we're all trying to figure out. Loss of agricultural land, urbanization, clean farming, that's farming right up to the roadside and removing hedgerows, insecticides and rodenticides, predation by Cooper's hawks, competition with starlings for nest sites, and low fledgling survival. These are all possible reasons for the decline. And one thing that the late Roger Jones pointed out to me, he was a hawk vendor in our area. He noticed that on his brother's property, when it grew up, when Bruce, his brother, promoted native plants and let it grow up into a native meadow, that the kestrels pretty much disappeared. So this really got my interest because, of course, I'm a restoration ecologist. So we're trying to rehabilitate these landscapes and convert them to native plants, which then should build the foundation for all the insects and birds and everything else that lives there. But we're seeing some unintended consequences of meadow restoration. So this really was interesting to me, and I wanted to figure out if it was happening across the landscape or if it was just peculiar to this one property. And we wanted to find out also the mechanisms behind it, if this was really happening. So what do we know? So the kestrel is a pretty common bird, but we actually don't know a lot about its detailed, the details of its habitat requirements. So it's found in big open fields, relatively far from forests. It prefers short fields, less than 10 inches tall. They usually require big patches of habitat, like greater than 3,000 acres, at least in a mosaic. But like I said, the details are not well understood. So we wanted to know which of the 4 major field types in the mid-Atlantic were preferred by kestrels. So cattle pastures, hay fields, row crops, and wildflower meadows. We realized pretty early on that we were going to need to tag birds and track them to find out what kinds of habitats they were using. And we also wanted to learn how big their territories were and how often they were leaving their territories, because this is all fundamental information for trying to understand how to manage habitat for a species. And so when we started looking into the literature, we were surprised to see that not a lot had been done, actually, and not a lot was known about kestrel home range size. But the studies that were available suggested it was about 190 acres. And there was really limited information on forays. Those are trips outside the home range, or home range shifts. That's when birds have an established home range and then they move to another home range. Again, this is really important if we want to figure out how to manage for the species. We also found out that the kestrels in Northern Virginia are really, it's not known what proportion of the population is migratory. The traditional way of looking at this is by attaching aluminum bands with unique numbers to the legs, and then the hope is that you'll recapture the bird and be able to and know where it came from. The problem with this is that the recapture rate is very low, like less than 2%. And so we really have limited information coming from banding. Nonetheless, the Moreaus have done fantastic work over the years. In the Shenandoah Valley, they've banded a lot of kestrels, and they found that about 4% of the kestrels that they band on the breeding season are recaptured in the same area in the winter. So clearly, at least some of our birds are resident. And in contrast to that, they found only 0.2% of their birds were captured outside their study area. So we've come up with a lot of questions. This is going to be our third year of kestrel research, and we've started to get some answers, but we're finding new questions that we want answers to. That's how science goes. First off, how big are American kestrel home ranges? Secondly, once they've established a home range, do they stick to it, or do they make lots of extraterritorial forays? Do they shift their home ranges as the breeding season progresses? Are kestrels in our area migratory? Which of the 4 major open habitats in the mid-Atlantic are preferred by kestrels, and how does this differ between the sexes? And finally, is fledgling mortality responsible for the decline? So now I'll move on to our methods. So I'll start by talking about the other 2 principal investigators on this project, Joe Kolowski and Alan Williams. Joe Kolowski is a scientist at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, and he has a background in analyzing data from marked animals. Alan Williams is doing this totally on a volunteer basis, but he's a very serious hawkbander and kestrel lover who has monitored a huge network of kestrel boxes, and he has kindly joined us and really made this project happen. And last year, we were lucky to have 3 great technicians, Kaylin Wolfer, Sophie Vasquez, and Megan McDaniels. We're lucky to have Kaylin and Sophie returning for this season. And Megan, we're sorry to see her go, but she's starting a PhD at UC Davis, which is great for her. So like I said, we realized pretty early on that we were going to need to track these birds to figure out what was happening and how we can manage habitat for them. And it turns out that the best way to catch a kestrel is in the nest box. And on the photo on the right, you can see we have a painter's pole with a camera on the end and a little yogurt cup. And we use this to plug the entrance and to see what's happening inside. And so if there's a kestrel inside, then we put up the ladder and we sneak in and try not to let the bird go when we grab it from the side of the box. So like I mentioned, Alan has been managing a big network of boxes, and we've had some as well and other collaborators. There's lots of people working on this. As of last year, we were working with 163 nest boxes in these 2 counties. And the blue dots are showing those boxes, and the yellow dots are showing females that we tracked in 2021. So there are 2 main methods if you want to track birds. You can use radio telemetry, or you can use GPS tags. Radio telemetry is the old standby. So you attach a radio transmitter, in this case with a backpack harness, and it emits a radio signal. Then you're able to pick that up with an antenna and find out what direction the bird is. If you're lucky and it's sitting up in a tree, you can look through the scope and see where it is, and you can get a location that way. But you often have to triangulate. You have to go to another area, get another bearing, and try to find out where the bird is. And so this is this is an old, reliable method, relatively cheap, not solar powered. So when the battery dies, you're done. And you have to be within about 1.2 miles to pick up the signal from the bird. But the main drawback to this technology is that you have to be in the field to get each location, and you have to take each location manually. So it's pretty limited, but we used it for fledgling, so it worked for that application. But luckily, GPS transmitters have just become light enough to attach to American kestrels. And this is really the core of our research. So we attach GPS transmitters, again, via backpacks, but these are pretty different devices. So they communicate with satellites, and they record the locations of the bird on the unit. So they download the locations to the unit. And then if you're within a mile of the unit, you can download all those locations in one go onto your computer. So if the bird disappears for a few days and comes back, you download it and you find out everywhere it's been every 20 minutes, if that's the schedule. So a very powerful technology. It's brand new, like I said, and so potentially unreliable, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. It's also expensive. They're about $1,200 a piece. These photos show what it's like to be working with the birds in the field. So we're attaching backpack transmitters here. You can see it's a really delicate job, and it has to be, we were trained by scientists at Hawk Mountain on how to do this, and it has to be just the right amount of tightness. You don't want it too tight or too loose. It takes about 30 minutes to do the whole procedure, and everything we attach weighs less than 4% of the body weight. So it doesn't affect the flight behavior of these birds. And as you'll see, we've documented some really long distance movements with tag birds, so it really doesn't seem to affect them. So in 2021, we tagged 19 adult females with GPS transmitters. Last year, we had planned to tag a lot more, but we only tagged 4 males and 2 new females, and because of the technical difficulties. So unfortunately, our transmitters last year didn't work, the new transmitters we got. So these were all with old tags. And we were lucky to be able to continue to track 9 females that we tagged in 2021. So we actually got a lot of good data last year anyway. We also worked with fledglings last year. So we tagged 20 fledglings with radio transmitters. And this radio telemetry project is a collaboration with Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania. And there's several other research groups in the Mid-Atlantic that are also a part of this project. We tagged 20 fledglings that came from 10 nests, and we tracked them from June to October. So we tracked them at least twice a week. And the main goal of this was to see how they fared in the first 2 weeks of their life outside the nest box. This is a really vulnerable time for a kestrel. And one of the theories is that mortality during that period is a part of the reason for the decline. Sorry, I have a cat in my lap here. We did some other work with fledglings as a part of this project. We monitored growth and development in 20 clutches. We measured the tarsus, tail, and wing cord. We took down the weight, and we also scored their fat to see how they were doing. The third thing we did with fledglings was blood sampling. So we collected blood from 46 different nestlings. And the goal of this was to test for rodenticides, insecticides, and herbicides. So I won't get too much into data analysis, but just to keep, just the bare bones so that hopefully everybody can understand what we did. So this is a hypothetical bird range. And so the little points that you see are locations for this bird. And then you can see that a minimum convex polygon has been put around all of these points. And so this is the simplest way of estimating a home range. You simply draw the polygon around all the points. The problem with this method is that there's a bunch of area inside of this so-called home range where the bird never went. And so this is a big problem. So luckily they've come up with a lot of different statistical methods to deal with this. And we are working with autocorrelated kernel density estimators. And this is what you see here with the red curve. It's showing a home range that incorporates 95% of the points and leaves the last 5% out on purpose. But this gives you a more accurate representation of the home range. And I've talked about extraterritorial forays a bit. So we wanted to see, once they had a territory established, how restless were they? Were they out exploring or not? And we decided to define an extraterritorial foray as a trip that was 535 feet outside the home range boundary. And so that's shown by the dashed white line. And 535 feet is the average distance from the nest box to the home range boundary. So we figured that was a pretty conservative threshold. And here you can see there are quite a few little green dots, which are locations of the bird that are outside the home range, but we don't consider them forays because that's just a little bit of moving around. But then the dots that are circled with yellow, we consider those to be extraterritorial forays. All right, now the good part, to the results. So we tracked 25 adult kestrels with GPS transmitters in 2021 and 2022. And we had an average of 1,710 locations for each female in 2021. So we had this gold mine of data coming from these GPS transmitters. And last year, like I said, there were technical problems, but we were still able to get really good data from 3 males, track them for a long time. And this is what the results look like. So in this figure, each bird is shown by a different color, and you can see that they have pretty small home ranges. If you know the Clifton Institute, well, and you see the scale, it's only a mile. So these home ranges are really packed in tight, and they hardly overlap at all. Home ranges average just 78 acres in our area, which is among the smallest home range ever reported for the species. And I'm going to be showing a lot of these home range maps, which are really fun to look at. And you can look at them for yourself, and they're constantly updated at cliftoninstitute.org/research. Especially if you have one of these birds in your neighborhood, take a look. So for forays, we documented an impressive 190 extraterritorial forays. And they averaged 1.7 miles in distance, and they went up to 80 miles. And we recorded forays in all of the birds that we tracked. And this is quite unusual for birds or mammals with home ranges of this size. So these are pretty restless animals, at least in our area. 5 of the tracked females shifted their home ranges after their fledglings left. So this is a total shift in the home range. And these shifts range from 1 to 7 miles. So we analyzed movements of these birds in 3 tracking periods. The first was a nestling period when there are babies in the box. The second is a fledgling period. This is in between the time when the birds leave the box and when the last fledgling is seen. And finally, the post-fledgling period. This is after the fledglings are gone, and it goes until September 15th. So here's an interesting example. So this is a female that we that bred in a box at the Clifton Institute, and you can see her nest box is shown by the black target. The white targets are additional nest boxes in the area, and the lilac dots are her locations. You can also see her home range that we calculated for during the nesting period and a few forays. But once the babies fledged out of the box, this female really started covering a lot of ground. So she went to 3 different areas, and these areas were so dispersed that it was actually not appropriate statistically to even create a home range during this period. But interestingly, she decided that one of those areas was really great. And so after the fledglings were totally gone, she set up shop over there. But she continued to do forays and continued to explore adjacent habitats. This is another example. This is a male. This bird is called Rabbit, and he nested in a box at Clifton. And if you were tagging this bird with a radio tag instead of a GPS tag, and you had data like this, you would think that this bird, was pretty much just hunting right around the nest box. And with a radio tag, this is all you're going to get. You're not going to be able to get data from further away, so you really don't know what's happening. But luckily, we have GPS tags, and we discovered that this bird was commuting 7 miles every day to his favorite hunting grounds. So this was pretty amazing. And he follows the same track back and forth every day. So you can see really clearly in the data what he's up to. He's flying over the CIA base and headed down to 211. And if you zoom in on those hunting grounds, this is what it looks like. So we have this really accurate data showing us where he's perching and exactly what kinds of fields he's hunting in. And I saw him sitting on those wires yesterday on 211. So if you're leaving Warrenton heading west, keep your eye out for Rabbit. He's still hanging out. And we documented some even longer distance movements. So this bird bred near Airlie. And then once her fledglings were gone, she went on a so-called summer vacation. She flew way up to Pennsylvania and spent like a month up in some cornfields in Pennsylvania. Pretty cool. And then she decided to come straight back, and she wintered along Cannonball Gate Road, just a couple miles away from Airlie. We were still in the dark at this point. We didn't know, because again, you have to be within a mile to download the locations off of the unit. But luckily, she came back to our area for the breeding season, and we got this amazing download that showed where she had been for pretty much the previous year. Pretty awesome. And we documented some even longer distance movements. So we now have solid evidence that kestrels in our region, at least some of them, are migratory. And so we had one bird from Kinloch and one bird from Clifton who went down to Georgia and South Carolina for the winter. And so this, the banding data was sort of suggesting that most of our birds might be resident, but now we know that at least some of them are migratory. We still don't know the proportion. And an amazing thing is that when these birds want to move, they go. And so both of these birds, when they were ready to go back to Virginia, it took them only 2 days to fly from South Georgia and South Carolina back to Northern Virginia. Now on to our habitat selection results. So as a reminder, we're comparing the suitability of the 4 major grassland types in the mid-Atlantic: cattle pastures, hayfields, row crops, and wildflower meadows. And I'll show you a couple examples. So this first example is from near Little Washington, and this whole area is cattle pasture. Surprise. If you look at this, so this is showing the range for during the nestling period. So this is while there are babies in the box, and the green dots are showing where she was ranging. So pretty close around the nest box. Once the fledglings were out of the box, she expanded a little bit, but she was still in these cattle pastures in the same area. And then in the post-fledgling period, she's in exactly the same area. So this bird ended up spending like a whole year and basically in the same couple of fields, all of which are cattle pastures. Now, this is a very different example. This bird had access to a lot of different kinds of fields right around the nest box. This is along Blantyre Road. This is like probably the easiest place to see a kestrel in Northern Virginia. If you're driving on Blantyre Road, one of our birds is always sitting on the wires there. So you see where the nest box is. The green dots are showing her locations during the nestling period when there are babies in the box. The red dots are showing when the fledglings are hanging around, and the blue dots are showing where she was after the fledglings left. So these were cornfields. They were actually in April. They had cover crops on them, or they were bare ground, so they were really short. And this bird foraged pretty close around the nest box in these cornfields. But then as the corn grew, she shifted to adjacent pasture. She used some of the cornfields, but she started to use adjacent pastures. And then later in the season, she was only in pastures and including an adjacent line. So here we see a really different story from the last one. And I showed these maps, those 2 examples in my talk last year. I thought they were really interesting, but we hadn't been able, we just didn't have time to do the analysis of all the habitat. And now luckily I can report to you all what we found. So we've looked at all of our birds, and we've done quantitative comparisons and found out what kinds of habitats they prefer. So this is another home range. This is one near Airlie. You can see the pink dots are locations, and you can see the home range. And this is mostly cattle pasture. And then our colleagues and collaborators and technicians have done really hard work to classify the habitats within this home range. Here you can see that it's mostly pasture, the blue area, with some meadow and some forest and a little bit of lawn. And so it seems, if you look at this is a habitat within the home range. It seems that this bird is selecting cattle pasture. But the way to know for sure is to compare the habitat proportions within the home range to the habitat proportions in the surrounding landscape. And so that's what we did. You can see here the home range is shown with the black outline. And you can see that when you go out a half mile from the nest box, that there is still a lot of pasture, a lot of forest in the area, but a lot of other habitat types as well. And so what we did is we made these comparisons for all of our birds. And this is what we found. So during the nestling period, this is 14 birds that we did this comparison for. On the y-axis is the percent composition of habitat type, and on the x-axis is the habitat type. And so for me, the first thing that jumps out here is that the blue bar for meadow is a lot taller than the yellow bar for meadow. And that is showing that early in the season, these birds are selecting meadows to forage in. So the surrounding landscape has a lot less meadow than the territory. We're also seeing a similar pattern, although not quite as strong with the pasture, where they're selecting more pastures than there are in the available surrounding landscape. But maybe not too surprisingly, based on that last example I showed you, later in the season, meadow becomes really unappealing, and cattle pastures become even better. And so this, we think is because the meadows are getting taller. We're going to be doing some detailed analyses on this with resource selection function modeling to find out exactly what's happening with vegetation height and vegetation density. And we'll get back to you next year on that. But this sure seems to indicate that pastures are good year-round, whereas meadows are good only early in the season. And both of them seem to be better than the other grassland types. And then one tidbit on the habitat. So if we go back to Bruce Jones's property and look at some data we got on a bird there, we didn't get a lot of locations on this bird, but it's already telling the data that we did get. You can see that Bruce has mowed some extra wide trails through his tall meadows here. And this kestrel is hunting along those trails because presumably the food is more accessible. So this is pretty interesting. This is something that, pretty much any landowner can do, mowing extra wide trails through their meadows. But like anything in habitat management, you have to be a little careful because you could be mowing over grassland birds breeding in there or turtles. So maybe send Marie an email if you want to try this and we can try to figure out the best way to do it. Finally, I'll talk about fledgling movements and mortality. So luckily, none of our 20 birds were confirmed to die during that critical 2-week period. We tracked them throughout that period and they made it okay. So that's good. And we even tracked some of them into October. So they, the battery, pretty much as long as the battery lasted, we were keeping track of them, which is cool. No rodenticides have been found in the blood samples so far. Analysis is still ongoing for rodenticides and the other compounds. But this is suggesting that maybe fledgling mortality is not a big reason for decline in our area. But since we were doing all that work, we were measuring the nestlings and seeing how they were doing, tracking their growth and development, visiting the nest box 3 times during the period. We ended up finding an unexpected result, and that was that quite a few of the nestlings ended up dying in the box. And we have no idea why this happened. But this year we're going to be putting security cameras in the boxes so to hopefully figure out what's happening in there, see how it's related to what they're bringing to the babies, how frequently they're feeding them and things like that. We need to figure out what's happening because that could actually be a problem. These babies are not even making it out of the box. And given these amazing movements I've showed you so far, it's not too surprising, I guess, that the fledglings would have been moving around as well. But we had to be really lucky to be able to detect one of these movements. So this, because of the technology. So if you remember, you have to be within 1.2 miles to pick up the bird, and you have to be in the field at that time to find it. So this bird fledged out of a box near Orleans on Crest Hill Road. And then we were tracking fledglings at Clifton and nearby at Hazel, and we ended up bumping into this bird there. So this bird decided to make the 10-mile flight straight to the east to the pastures of Clifton and Hazel, which is pretty cool. And another thing we noticed, which is just like anecdotal, but the fledglings seemed to be hanging out with each other. So there were fledglings from multiple nests all hanging out together in a flock. And it seemed like maybe they were learning how to be a kestrel together, which is cool. So what do all these results mean in terms of land management? First of all, an easy one, our kestrel population includes sedentary and migratory birds. Home ranges for our females were very small, which to me indicates that there's good habitat in our area. So if they're getting what they need in a small area, then they won't need to use a larger home range. And this is supported by some other data from the Moreaus and from Joe Kolowski, showing really high nest box occupancy and nest success in our area. So they seem to be doing relatively well in Northern Virginia compared to other places in the Northeast. We found a lot of extraterritorial forays and range shifts. And we were only able to track 3 males in detail, but they are indicating pretty strongly that they fly a lot farther away from the nest box for hunting. So that one bird that flew down to 211, that was not an anomaly. And so all of this extra movement and forays and home range shifts is telling us that, yes, it's important to manage the habitat around the nest box, but we have to recognize that these birds are going to be using fields far away from the nest box as well. And that's really important when we're trying to make a plan for how to manage habitat for this species. And like I mentioned, cattle pastures seem to be good habitat year-round, whereas native meadows are maybe even a little better than cattle pastures early in the season. We need to tag more birds to define this, but I think the cattle pasture result is probably not going to change, but interesting to see. So does this mean that we should be converting all of our beautiful native grasslands to fescue pastures so that they are the right structure for kestrels and other grassland birds? You can probably guess my response to that. But I'll go through the pros and cons. So tall fescue cattle pastures are good habitat for kestrels, obviously, as well as other declining grassland birds, some of which are not doing as well as kestrels. So grasshopper sparrows, meadowlarks do just fine in cattle pastures, according to research done by Virginia Working Landscapes. It's important in these cases to not have that many cows in the pasture, but it seems like fescue pastures are pretty good for our declining shortgrass species. But of course, there are a lot of issues, problems with fescue pastures. These are simplified plant communities that are dominated by just a few non-native plants, which leads to limited animal diversity in the fields. Most insects cannot eat the non-native plants in these fields, so of course, then there's not much food for the birds. Fescue pastures are unsuitable for quail, who experienced a catastrophic decline in our area. And fescue pastures are really poor habitat for pollinators as well. Finally, fescue seeds are mildly toxic to birds. They fed them to juncos and they lose weight when that happens. So what do we do? So this is something that we at Clifton and other organizations are thinking a lot about, and we at Clifton are thinking about doing some research on this in the coming years. The idea is that if we are able to have our native meadows and manage them with cows, that hopefully we'll be able to maintain the appropriate habitat structure for these declining shortgrass birds, while at the same time having high plant diversity and providing pollinator habitat in these fields. So this has been done successfully in Nebraska. The Nature Conservancy has been doing this for quite a while. They're combining fire with grazing to accomplish this and create the right heterogeneity of the different kinds of fields that all the different species need. But it hasn't been done much at all in the East, and so we hopefully will be working on this in the future. Another big advantage of this approach would be that we keep agricultural lands productive in our area. And as everybody knows, urban development is a huge threat. So, if you can't farm the land anymore, then, why not drop a data center on it? So hopefully, a solution that involves cows will help us a little bit get around the problems that we're facing in our region. So what's coming? This is a really exciting year. This is going to be our biggest year yet for kestrel research. We have a kestrel project manager and 4 technicians who will be working with us this year. We're going to hopefully be tagging 20 females and 20 males with GPS tags to really up our sample size and really refine our results. Like I've mentioned a couple of times, we're going to be installing security cameras in 30 nest boxes. We've actually already done most of it this year. We have just a few to go. And you can see the nest boxes in the back of the truck here. They have an extra little house on top, and that's where the security camera goes. And the goal of this, there are lots of goals, being able to see what's happening in the nest box. We want to know how frequently they're being fed. We want to know what they're being fed. We want to know what's happening and why some of the babies are dying in there. And ideally, we want to try to link up the data that we're getting to the tracking data. We're also, I'm really excited about this, we're going to be quantifying prey abundance in different field types this year. And so this, I hope, is going to tell us what is it about cattle pastures that's so good for kestrels? And is there any way that we can improve cattle pastures further, like planting, for example, wildflower strips along the edges or something that would maybe be a source of more kestrel food that then becomes more catchable out in the short grass that's adjacent to those patches, while also, of course, providing pollinator habitat and restoring the native plant communities. This picture is showing a track pad. So the idea here, you've got some paper there in the middle. This is a gutter that's been cut in half, and there's paper with peanut butter, and then there are 2 ink pads on the ends. And so what happens is you set out an array of these traps, and then you the mice leave footprints, and you're able to quantify mouse abundance by putting out lots of these no-kill traps. So we're going to be doing that. We're also going to be doing dragonfly and grasshopper surveys to try to quantify them as food sources for kestrels. And we're going to be doing some surveys of small birds as well as food sources for kestrels. Another aspect we're pursuing related to that is that it's a really lovely job that I don't know who's going to have this job yet. Cleaning up the remains of prey items at the end of the season out of the nest boxes. So that's another way of finding out what they're being fed. And it'll be really interesting to connect those data to the tracking information and also to compare what they're actually eating to what's available from our prey abundance surveys in the different kinds of fields. But what can you do to help kestrels? The easiest thing is to install and maintain a nest box. So if you have a big field on your property, you can do that. It's pretty easy. And you can make friends with your neighbors. It's pretty easy to set these up. Maintaining is important. We don't want to be breeding starlings. So if you see starlings nesting in there, you want to throw the nest out. A general recommendation we give to people that includes, that also works for kestrels, is mowing your fields annually in February. And you may want to mow some wide trails to help the kestrels hunt if you have a tall meadow. And it's a really good idea, if you have enough land, to maintain fields of different heights. Some for quail and pollinators, others for shortgrass species. Finally, you want to minimize or eliminate the use of insecticides and rodenticides. So if you'd like to put up a nest box, Coveside has some commercial boxes that are about the right size. They're pretty good. You can also follow the plans on our website. That's about, they're about right what you want. So they include a rim on the bottom that'll keep the eggs from rolling out. And like I say, it's pretty easy. You want a 2x4x12 to set these up, and you screw it into a fence post. And don't forget the predator guard. That's really important as well to keep the snakes out. But if you'd like more information on this, you can go to our resources website. So before I finish up, I want to acknowledge a few of the many people that made all this possible. This is I don't think I've ever been involved with a research project with so many people all working together seamlessly. So we're really lucky to have an array of technicians and volunteers and partners on this. October Greenfield, Patty Lane, Mercy Millo, Sarah Kane, Valentine Herman, Josh Rector, Dick Rains, Mike DeLello, and Sean Engel, among many others. Alex Shippard, of course, as well. A lot of volunteers I didn't mention, landowners who allowed research. So the Eldon property, Hazel, Hinchman, Kinlock, Lapham, Rains, Bolgeno, Bachmeister. None of this would happen without funding from the Rains Family Fund and the Band Foundation. Other important donors: Nick Lapham, Virginia Society of Ornithology, Washington Biologist Field Club, Peregrine Fund, Janine Mosley, and Eldon Farm. And finally, our partners, Hawk Mountain, Mercy, and JF, Oak Spring Garden, especially Josh, and Sunnyside. So thank you all very much for joining. And at this point, I think Eleanor is gonna feed me some questions.
Okay, so there's only two, so this is your chance to type questions. You can either, I have the chat open and the Q&A box open. Let's see, the first question is, do you need volunteers to help monitor the kestrels?
Yes. Yeah, we're always looking for volunteers. So yeah, if you're interested in that, you can send us an email. That would be great. My email is right there on that slide.
There you go. And yeah, anyone who's interested in general, the summer is the busiest season, and it's great. It's best if volunteers can kind of commit to a regular schedule. So it's like every Saturday or every Wednesday or whatever works for you. But that seems to be the most productive way. So anyone who's out there who's willing to do that would be lovely. Another question, will the breeding pair that was in our box last year come back?
Sometimes they do. The same bird. Yeah, I mean, we do have repeat offenders, but they seem to shuffle around. I mean, I think Alan, I think, is on the call. He could probably answer this better, but they seem to shuffle around a bit and stay in the neighborhood. But if you've had a box that was occupied in one year, it's likely to be occupied in the next year, but not necessarily by the same individual bird.
And am I correct in saying that the nests in our area tend to be, there's a very high occupancy rate? So in general, the boxes seem to be snatched up pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, another question. Any research in warm season grass areas?
I'm not sure I quite get that. I mean, I think in terms of, that's like I guess one of our questions is, how are meadows suitable or not? And when I say meadow, I mean warm season native meadows. And so it appears that late in the season, they're not suitable for kestrels or other shortgrass birds, but early in the season they are. And that's kind of a bummer. That's what we're trying to figure out.
Okay, how do you plan on catching more males? And maybe maybe you want to explain why you've had fewer males in your study than females. It's not a catching issue, but maybe you can explain why there were fewer males overall.
It is partially a catching issue because it seems like they're farther away from the nest box. They're not spending as much time in there when they're babies. So it is harder to catch males. You have to be more persistent. Having cameras in the boxes that we can look at remotely is going to really help. So we're going to be able to be much more targeted and efficient when we're catching birds. But like I mentioned briefly, the transmitters that we got last year didn't work. So we had 4 transmitters to play with. So that's why we only tagged 4 males.
And any strategies for catching more males this summer?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, using the cameras, I think, is the best way.
There you go. Is there a way to make the nest box undesirable to starlings?
I don't think so. They like the same thing as kestrels, and I'm not aware of a way of doing that. But the thing is, I guess I would say the thing is that you want to put a box in a place that's really good kestrel habitat, because if the kestrels like it, they're going to kick out the starlings. So if you have a really wide open field and really no trees around, then you're more likely to get a kestrel. But they prefer the same kind of box. So you can't change the opening size or anything like that.
Okay, a few related questions. There's a question about harriers, one about red-tailed hawks, and one about Cooper's hawks. So can you say anything about how kestrels compete with any of those species?
Well, Cooper's hawks, out of those 3, Cooper's hawks are probably the most relevant because they eat kestrels. And so they've even been observed trap lining kestrel boxes. So they fly around from one box to the next trying to catch kestrels. So Cooper's hawks are, like I said, that's one hypothesis for one of the reasons behind the decline is Cooper's hawks, because their population is increasing. So the idea there, if you want to try to mitigate some of that, is by putting boxes again in wide open fields far away from trees, where accipiter hawks are less likely to go. Although I still see Coopers and Sharpies out in the middle of fields sometimes. Red tails, they're eating a lot of voles, just like kestrels, and so are harriers. So yeah, they're in similar habitats.
Are horse pastures as good as cattle pastures?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we, I showed the one bird who shifted its range over to Highway 17, and it moved over to some horse pastures on 17. So they definitely do use horse pastures, but we don't have a good sample size of them yet. So we can't answer that definitively, but presumably it's going to be pretty similar.
What was your most exciting or interesting kestrel finding to date, or any surprising hypothesis that was disproved?
Wow. Well, I think the bird rabbit who is commuting every day down to 211, I just was blown away by that. I had no idea, like, why in the world is that bird doing that? I mean, it's surrounded by all these great pastures and meadows of different kinds, and the females seem to be making it just fine, foraging right around the nest box. So why does he have to fly 7 miles multiple times a day to go down there? What is so great about those farms along 211? How does he make that decision versus flying somewhere else? It was 7 miles in a different direction one day or something. It's just, there's a lot that we still have to learn, I think.
Great. A couple more related questions. Everyone's got their minds on the same track. So with respect to fledglings, I guess there's a few questions about how closely boxes can be spaced. So one person's asking about whether you need to give fledglings space to disperse. Another is asking if they can be within sight of each other. Another person's asking whether it helps them to be in the same area. So any advice about how closely spaced boxes can be?
3/10 of a mile is the minimum spacing. Like a half mile is kind of like a good rule of thumb. It depends. If you got really great habitat, then definitely like 1/4 mile, 3/10 of a mile is the spacing. And they pack right in there, as you can see in our data. You can see how tightly they pack in there. In terms of the fledglings, I wouldn't worry about it. Actually, like I said, it seems like they are kind of social even, maybe. So it's no problem if you have fledglings from one nest next to another nest. They seem to hang out. So.
Great. A couple of geography questions. Are there any plans to do this in Frederick County or at Blandy, or do you need data on boxes in Loudoun or Western Fairfax?
Yeah, so we would, ideally we would love to expand, but it's just impossible. I mean, I think the amount of data that we're collecting requires us to be within a predefined area. So it's going to be Fauquier and Rappahannock for this year, and probably foreseeable years in terms of like inclusion in this research project. But for data on nest boxes, definitely always interested to hear about nest boxes and see if they're occupied boxes and how they're doing. And it's a good idea to enter your data on NestWatch, Cornell NestWatch, so that everybody can see the data. And we're definitely always want to be in touch with people all around the region. If you're keeping track of kestrels, that's great. But like I said, we can't include other counties in the actual research at this point.
And another question about who to talk to about where to put up boxes. You can always email Bert and he'll try to give you tips about your situation. Let's see, just a couple more questions. Someone's asking about hay fields. So you talked a bit about cattle pastures. Are hay fields also good habitat?
Yeah, so again, we need a little bit better sample, but from what we've got so far, it seems like hay is like just sort of mediocre. And I don't have an answer for why that would be. The signal is a little bit complicated because hay is cut, a couple of times a year. And so that will be cool to see, like when I give this talk next January, we're going to be talking about our really detailed analysis on vegetation height. And so we actually went out there and measured the height of grass and hay fields before and after they were cut. And we're linking that up to the tracking data to see how that affects when kestrels are out there. So hayfields may seem like, if you look at our analysis, hayfields may seem to be not that good, but that could be because the kestrels are just waiting for them to be cut before they go into them.
Great. Okay, a few questions about fledglings. Are there plans to do necropsies on deceased fledglings to see what's causing mortalities? Can you say a bit more about the tests that were done on the fledglings that we already have? Any ideas about what's killing the fledglings in the boxes?
Yeah, I mean, starvation is a possibility, you know, if one of the parents dies or something, you know, that could be the problem. It didn't seem to be disease, but we don't know. And yes, we are doing necropsies on some of these birds. We're sending them to Hawk Mountain and they're being analyzed. We don't have any results from those yet. On the blood samples, yeah, so like I said, some results are coming in from rodenticides from around the different states that are part of this project, and nothing has come back for rodenticides. But they're doing tests for a huge number, like more than 50 different kinds of insecticides and herbicides, to see if any of those are present in the blood. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of delays in the lab. We're still waiting on that to start.
Okay, I think there's one more unduplicated question, which is, do you have any data on nesting success during cicada years versus non-cicada years?
Yeah, I don't. I heard from somebody that they just kind of, you know, they eat a lot of cicadas, but they're hard to digest and they don't get a lot of food out of them. But I can't say much on that, unfortunately.
And I would say probably a lot of our study area was, you know, the periodical boundary was pretty close, but didn't quite get to a lot of our study area. So I bet a lot of these kestrels were not exactly in areas where the cicadas were emerging recently. I think that is all the questions. I think I've gotten to them all. If not, you can frantically repeat your question in the Q&A box, but I think that's it.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. And we look forward to seeing you in person at Clifton. And if not, when we give our next research talk. Thanks a lot.
Oh, Bert, are you there?
Yep.
There was one question I missed.
Okay.
Any kestrels which have chased off other species, such as screech owls or squirrels that occupy the nest boxes during non-breeding season?
Wait, I'm sorry. Say it again, please.
Any stories about kestrels chasing off screech owls or squirrels or other species that are occupying the nest boxes during non-breeding season?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. Yeah, the screech owls. The thing is, you know, it seems like, you know, a good chunk of our population is migratory in the winter, so they do kind of thin out in the winter, and that's when the screech owls are in there.
Okay, now really the questions are done.
Okay, thanks everybody.